The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
If you don't think Doug Ford is conservative enough, there are new choices on the ballot this time round. Does Ontario want or need them? Tonight, we're looking at the state of the right and polarization in this 43rd general election. First, did the deal with the federal government on childcare mean it's not really an election issue? Not quite. We'll find out more. It's Tuesday, May 31st, and that's ahead on the agenda. Ontario was the last province to sign on to the federal $10 a day childcare program. It's an affordability measure intended to help parents of young kids. That usually makes it fodder for the campaign trail, too. With us to find out whether that's the case and what voters have to choose amongst the party's platforms, we welcome, in the nation's capital, Athena Basiliadis, childcare worker at Glebe Parents Daycare in Ottawa and executive member of CUPE Local 2204. In Hamilton, Ontario, Adrian Davidson, assistant professor of political science at McMaster University. And here in the provincial capital, Carolyn Ferns, public policy and government relations coordinator at the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare. And we're delighted to welcome you three onto our program tonight. Without further ado, just sit back and be comfortable for a moment, because we want to go through what all four major parties have on offer as it relates to childcare in this campaign. And I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring these graphics up. The PC party is offering, as mentioned, that deal with the feds, lower childcare to $10 a day by September 2025, creating 86,000 new spaces. That includes 15,000 spots already added since 2019, and set a wage floor for all childcare workers of $18 an hour, with annual increases up to $25 an hour. What about the NDP? Well, they would explore ways to get to a $10 a day childcare agreement faster by working with the feds, immediately increase the standard wage to $25 an hour for registered early childhood educators and $20 an hour for all other program staff, create a province-wide strategy to guarantee expansion of public and nonprofit childcare. The Liberal parties next, they would maintain the $10 a day daycare, but make the discounts retroactive to January 1st, 2022, to make up for the months of negotiations. Ontario, of course, the last province to sign on. They'd create 30,000 new jobs for early childhood educators and bring compensation into line with full-day kindergarten, and provide free tuition for all early childhood education programs at Ontario colleges. And finally, the Greens, they also say they'd work with the feds to ensure continued funding for $10 a day childcare and provide early childhood educators with a wage of at least $25 an hour. Okay, that's what they've got on offer. Let's go through this now and see what you like and what you don't. Carolyn, get us started here. What jumps out at you as being, yeah, I like that?
Sure. I guess the first thing that I really like is that we're in a situation here in the Ontario election where we have every party committed to $10 a day childcare. And that just shows what a game changer the federal childcare plan is. You know, if you'd asked me 4 years ago if we would have, every party in this election committed to $10 a day childcare, I wouldn't have believed it. But here we are. So I think that that's really good news. It means that we've really moved the needle on childcare, and that's a victory for advocates that have worked on this for the last 50 years.
Okay. Athena, how about you? What jumps out at you to the point where you can say, I like that?
Well, I have to agree with what Carolyn said. It's been a long time coming for us to see all parties talking about childcare as an election issue. What jumps out at me is the immediate increase with respect to the wages for childcare workers who have really been supporting childcare on the backs of their incomes for a very long time. So I think increasing the wage immediately is something that jumps out at me, as well as a number of other things that I'm sure we're going to talk about today. But that's one thing, and the parties need to work together in order to get this done.
Okay.
Workforce.
Gotcha. Adrian, how about you?
I mean, I think the thing that jumps out to me is, like sort of Carolyn said, we don't see a lot of difference between these parties on the commitment to childcare. And that's a great start, because so often in elections, it's been a case of, do we invest or do we not? And so all parties have come together and say, we are investing in childcare. the other thing that jumps out to me is this piece around workforce development, particularly the Liberal plan to reduce or eliminate tuition for ECE students, because so much work has to be done in order to create a well-educated care economy for our children.
Let me do a follow-up with you on that. Do you think that if that policy were to be implemented, that in fact more people would go into wanting to be early childhood educators who might not otherwise choose that path because they could get a free education in it?
I think that's part of the picture, and you see within the Liberal Party plan as well as in the NDP, it's not the only part of the picture. In order to make childcare a good place to work, we have to be making sure that we're paying care providers appropriately, that they can opt in to benefits or create sort of mechanisms to have benefits and potentially pensions. There's more that has to be done in order to make care work a place where people can build a career. And so that's part of the picture. The other part is obviously wage enhancements and benefits enhancements.
To that end, Athena, is there anything in any of the, as you look at all the programs, is there one that stands out above the others in terms of the issues that matter to you?
Well, I think that the ensuring that we're growing the system in the not-for-profit sector is a really important piece, which really relates to quality. So I think that, you know, the NDP plan, working with the federal government, increasing wages immediately, ensuring that we grow the system in a not-for-profit way, I think is something that really appeals to the workforce and to myself and those who advocates as well.
All right, let's now take, I mean, you've all told us what you really like about the plan. I'd like to find out now what you think is missing. Now, we obviously didn't put an exhaustive list of bullet points there for what's in all the plans, but you all have a good sense of it. Is there anything in the childcare plans, Carolyn, to you first, that you say, that should be in there and it's not?
Well, I mean, a good thing is that we see, you know, as Adrienne said, each of the parties is starting to grapple with the issue of the workforce. But I'd contend that, you know, for the most part, in the main, they don't go far enough, because right now we have a workforce crisis in childcare, right? We can't recruit and retain enough early childhood educators for the spaces that we have now. I know that there are programs across the province that are limiting their capacity, closing rooms because they don't have the staff. And if we want to expand childcare to serve many more families, we really have to grapple with the workforce crisis. So I think that commitments to decent work and pay, on that, the Conservative plan is nowhere near enough. You know, wage floor of $18 an hour, even they admit, would only help about a quarter of folks in the sector. So we need to do much better than that. You know, the Liberals have a plan to raise wages, which is good. The NDP say immediately raising the wages to $25 an hour, which I think is a very good start. And they also commit to consulting the sector on a proper workforce strategy, which is what we really need.
And if you had your druthers and the plans were more akin to what you have in mind, what should be in there, as opposed to the wage enhancements, I get that, but what else should be in there to get you to the promised land?
Yeah, sure. So on wages first, you know, the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare and the Association of ECEs have called for $25 for all childcare workers and $30 for registered early childhood educators, understanding that that's a regulated profession in Ontario. These are people with degrees and diplomas working in early childhood education. But we also need to have decent work standards. So, you know, paid sick days, professional development, and paid time for programs, right, which is so important. What we've seen in the pandemic is early childhood educators just burning out from, you know, from the level of stress and hard work that they've put in over the last few years. So we really need to reverse that. And we can't recruit our way out of it, right? We know that actually we have lots of graduates from early childhood programs, but they only stay in licensed childcare for about 3 years. And we need to change that to turn working in licensed childcare into a career for folks.
Okay. Adrienne Davidson, what didn't you see in any of those plans that you think ought to be there?
Well, I think, so, as I sort of said earlier, it's interesting to me that we see so much similarity between these plans. And the biggest place I see similarity is the agreement around 86,000 spaces. You know, none of these parties have said we are going to do more sooner than this, because this is provincial jurisdiction. This is the provincial playground. The federal government has, that agreement sets the floor of 86,000 spaces, or really 71,000 spaces, because we're already accounting for 15K. There's a lot more that the province could be doing. They could be putting up their own money. They could be thinking creatively about bringing unlicensed providers into the sector, pulling on the existing, workforce that's left early childhood education, and thinking creatively about how do we bring these people back in to do more spaces sooner. And so the fact that I haven't seen any innovation from any of the provinces there or any of the parties there, I think is actually quite surprising.
Athena, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Adrienne just said. If we really get to the $10 a day where the affordability is there for families, we're going to need a lot more spaces. I've heard numbers in the ballpark of 200,000 is what we're going to need. And I think that this, previously in past platforms and elections, they talk about choice. And you don't have a choice if you can't afford the actual care. And I think that that's something that we really need to hammer home, is that if you can't afford it, it's not accessible to you. It is not an option for you. So I would like to see more spaces being made available. But the only way we're going to get there is with the workforce strategy. And we really need to talk about this more.
Well, speaking of talking about this more, Athena, I'd like to get a better sense of what the last couple of years have been like for you and your colleagues who work at the Child Care Centre in Ottawa. Let's start with this. Did you have to close down at some point during the pandemic?
Well, we did close initially during the pandemic, and I think that programs had to close as a result of illness and not having staffing capacity to continue. So we did have some closures throughout the pandemic. But what we've seen is staff's inability to have any kind of time off. A lot of issues around sick leave, holiday leave. There's supreme burnout going on in the field. It's staggering. We talk about being forgotten on the front lines, and that's exactly what has happened. We were deemed essential workers, yet we weren't given pandemic pay. We weren't given any access to the things we needed at the onset to safely open our doors. And I'm talking about basic PPE, rapid testing, PCR testing, vaccination priority for staff, compensation in the form of pandemic pay, additional sick leave days. All of these things were extremely disheartening to the childcare workforce, and they've had a really, really staggering impact on the workforce. So you're seeing a lot of workplace stress, a lot of decrease in mental well-being and job satisfaction. You're seeing burnout in an unprecedented way, and a lot of people leaving the field through the pandemic and not returning. So when we talk about quality care is really dependent on continuity of care. And when you don't have that in the sector, we are not providing quality care. So this is a concern that we have too moving forward, is that unless we get a stable workforce, quality is going to decline within the sector. And that is something that my colleagues are really concerned about. The passion and the pride that people have for their work has decreased as a result of the stress-related issues that we're experiencing.
Well, that's not good, obviously. Now, one more follow-up to you, Athena, if I can. I've heard anecdotally that people have been so burned out that they have left the field entirely. But I want to know, do you know people for whom that is the case? Do you have colleagues who have quit and not come back?
Absolutely. I work in a community-based center in Ottawa, and we have seen 5 or 6 staff leave the field, take stress leaves, and who are thinking about not returning to the field. And these are passionate, dedicated childcare workers who've affected the lives of so many people, and they don't want to do this anymore. It's really not worth it.
Carolyn, that's one example at one childcare operator in one city. What about province-wide? Is that the same case?
Yeah. Absolutely. And, Athena said forgotten on the front line. And that's what we made the title of our report on the workforce. We did a survey back last spring asking early child educators how they were faring through the pandemic. And the responses that I saw, that we heard back, were so startling that I knew that we were, going to be facing a real crisis. And so we were ringing the alarm bell on that. And then, we started to see in the fall that childcare programs were closing rooms, some closing entire centers. not because they didn't have wait lists of families that wanted a space, but because they couldn't staff their programs, right? Because so many people were leaving. And of course, this is a concern. We talk about recruitment and retention, workforce crisis. But what does that mean for the child, right? And I can say as a parent, when my son started in childcare as an infant, I didn't used to say to him, we're going to childcare or we're going to school. I said, we're going to see Julia, because Julia was the ECE that he had bonded with. But if Julia isn't there on Monday because she's burned out or gone to another job, what does that mean for the experience of the young child? So as we're at this place where we're, going to be building a new kind of system and wanting to open up many more spaces to more families, we have to keep the experience of young children at the heart of this. And that's, I think, the primary reason that we need to solve the workforce crisis in childcare.
Okay. Adrienne, let me put a new issue on the table and put that to you. The childcare deal that the province of Ontario and the federal government have struck applies, as I understand it, only to licensed providers. And of course, and I understand why everybody in the sector is partial to licensed providers. There are, of course, plenty of unlicensed providers. And I want to know what you think all of this portends for parents who can only get access to unlicensed providers who may be, whatever, closer to home, in the neighborhood, just a better circumstance for their kids, et cetera.
Yeah, immediately it creates access issues and it creates equity issues. We know from research that a lot of the parents who use unlicensed providers are those who can't find anything else because they live in a childcare desert. It's not easily accessible or available. And they won't have access unless their provider becomes licensed. They will not necessarily have access to $10 a day childcare, and they certainly won't have access immediately once this plan goes into place. So we need to think a little bit more creatively, I think, about how we create pathways to licensing, make licensing attractive for independent providers who are currently unlicensed, and give opportunities for those families to participate and benefit from the $10 a day program.
Carolyn, what might that look like, that sort of easier pathway to licensing, which I guess all of you support?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think that, this is part of the expansion question that we need to grapple with, right? What's the expansion strategy for childcare? And I've certainly heard from families, just as Adrienne described, who've said, I'm with an unlicensed childcare provider. What do I do? They'd like to become licensed. How does that happen? And I say, contact a childcare agency. But if there's only one agency in their town or maybe nothing in their area, how does that happen, right? So I think that one of the things that we need to do, that the next provincial government needs to do, is really think about what is this expansion strategy, center-based and family home childcare, expanding home childcare agencies and making sure that they're good quality. As Adrienne said, breaking down those barriers so that unlicensed providers, who qualify can become licensed. So I think that that's really what we need to do. I think we need to be expanding in all areas of childcare for families.
Okay, I want to talk some hardball politics with you three, because I can't recall an election ever that I've covered where childcare didn't come up as an issue, except this one. Childcare has, have we heard, has any of it reached the public's attention during this campaign? It's been the quietest I can ever recall childcare being discussed during an election campaign. And I wonder whether that's because, and Athena, why don't you start with this one? Did the deal between the feds and the province basically remove childcare as a political/election issue because everybody thinks this is solved now?
Yeah, well, I think that is the case. I think that Ford's holdout, made our victory a little less sweet. And I think that was the intent, to hold out, to sign the agreement, and then move on and not have it be a topic of discussion, because really there's no plan in place for how we're going to get there. So I do think that was the strategy there. Check it off the list and move on, and not have it be a topic of discussion. It absolutely should be an election issue. The pandemic in the past 2 years have really served to magnify the importance of childcare and the need to build this Canada-wide system, but we really don't have any of the specifics, and we need to be talking about it. And I really do hope that when people are going to the polls, that even if they don't need childcare themselves, they know that their colleagues do in order to get to work. And it is a vital and critical service that we need to expand in a really mindful and thoughtful way.
Adrian, what do you think? Why has this not been a bigger election issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very surprising that we've heard more about, expanding or making available an optional grade 13 than we have about the biggest investment in early years learning ever. And that's not to, put aside the disruptions that students have experienced over the last 2 years, but we know from, an educational equality perspective, grade 13 only does so much. Where we see the huge investments in learning, where we see equality of opportunity gains, is when we invest in early years. And so it's really surprising to me that we haven't seen this politicized more, particularly because, parents are still holding the bag on having to pay childcare fees. Most parents I know haven't seen any of the money in terms of retroactive payments that were supposed to come before the election. We saw the provincial government drag its heels on negotiating, and that's had real sort of affordability concerns for parents even to today. So it is surprising to me that it hasn't come up more, given sort of both the fact that we have a lot to do on this file moving forward, as well as the uncertainty that parents are still experiencing.
In fact, Carolyn, Stephen Del Duca did an event in Oakville this morning at which he explicitly pointed out that the Liberals would make those payments retroactive back to January. We mentioned that earlier in this discussion. And that, to the best of his knowledge, no parents had received those retroactive payments, which the current government promised to do. So why hasn't childcare been a bigger issue in this campaign?
Yeah. Well, I think that, Athena, when you said that, the government signed just at the deadline, and that kind of, made it a non-issue. That's exactly what we heard from all of the other parties, when we reached out to them. Childcare is going to be there in our platform, but because there's not such a big contrast between us and each of the other parties, it's not going to be a huge issue for us. But I think that, even if it's not being discussed, it's certainly a big issue for parents. And that, as you said, Steve, the fact that no parents have actually received, lower fees at this point, I think that is an issue because, of course, Doug Ford, when he signed that agreement at the end of March, he promised parents that they'd start to see lower childcare fees in May, and that hasn't happened. Right?
And May's over.
I think it was an irresponsible promise to make. It was a promise made and a promise broken. So I think that should stick to them. The other thing I'd say really needs to stick to the Conservative Party is, if we look back over the past 4 years, sure, they signed that agreement in March, but they were dragged to the negotiating table kicking and screaming. It was months. We were the last province to sign on. And their record over the last 4 years on childcare has been, pretty lacking in ambition.
Well, let the record show we have not ignored childcare on this program, and which is why we wanted to have the three of you on to discuss it. And Carolyn, if you can do it in 10 seconds, because you have the province-wide view on this thing, what letter grade do you want to give the PC government for the last 4 years on childcare?
Well, I guess they would get, an incomplete on that last semester because they signed the agreement, but only, just on the deadline. But if I'm looking over the past 4 years, it's a failing grade. I mean, this is a provincial government that canceled a provincial plan for free preschool for young kids, that tried to cut $80 million from childcare, that watered down regulations, over and over again. I think they really did let families in the sector down on childcare. As Athena said, they ignored childcare through the pandemic and childcare workers through the pandemic in so many ways. So they definitely get a failing grade, I think, and maybe just squeaked through in that last semester by signing the agreement.
Adrian, I didn't ask you because I figure as a professor, you grade enough papers as it is and you don't want to do anymore. Adrian Davidson from McMaster University, Carolyn Ferns from the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, Athena Basiliadis, childcare worker at the Glebe Parents Daycare in Ottawa. It's good of all three of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the
Thanks for
opportunity.
having us.
In the federal election last fall, much was made about a new party to the right of the Conservatives. But on Election Day, that new party didn't win a seat, and support came in at just below 5%. Mind you, that's nearly double what the federal Greens got, and they elected 2 MPs. This Ontario election, there is more than one new entrant on the right. Will they make an impact at the polls? And if so, will it be to their benefit, or Doug Ford's detriment, or both? With us to consider that on Manhattan Island in New York City, Sean Speer, editor-at-large of The Hub and a senior fellow at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In the downtown core of Ontario's capital city, Ginny Roth, progressive conservative strategist currently working on Pierre Poilievre's federal conservative leadership bid. She's national practice lead for government relations at Crestview Strategy. And in Midtown, Martin Regcon, Queen's Park columnist for the Toronto Star. And it's great to welcome you three back to our airwaves. I want to start by quoting something from the National Post from this weekend that I suspect all of you saw. Ford Nation has been subsumed into the progressive Conservatives and moved sharply to the left, poaching in Liberal and NDP territory. It has driven those parties farther left, and the substantial minority of Ontarians, who are in fact moderately conservative, have effectively been invited to stick with the progressive Conservatives as the best they've got. In moving Ontario provincial politics so far to the left, Doug Ford has invited the vacuum on the right to be filled. And Jim and Belinda Karahalios, the former progressive Conservative MPP, expelled for sanity over COVID, have started that process. That's Lord Black of Cross Harbour, Conrad Black, writing that in the National Post, referring, of course, to the New Blue Party, which is one of the right-wing entrants on the Ontario political scene this campaign that the Karahalioses have formed. Ginny, I wonder if you could start us off by telling us whether, in your view, Lord Black's got it right.
Well, there's part of what Lord Black writes about that is compelling to me. I'm quite conservative myself in a sort of both ideological and cultural way. And so, yeah, at the height of COVID, actually, particularly as COVID dragged on, I think there was a sense among ideological conservatives for whom the state reaching into our life, the government reaching into our life and restricting, maybe even beyond what was required by the science, though that was certainly up for debate. There were many of us who sort of went, is this really necessary? I thought we had a majority PC government. What's going on? And so that part speaks to me. However, I think Lord Black is really simplifying in terms of his political analysis of what's going on. There's no question that the opposition parties, namely the NDP and the Liberals in Ontario, have sort of vacated the center of politics, vacated the space that is now being totally dominated by the Doug Ford PCs. But I think the reason he's been able to dominate that is because he's married a sort of centrist economics with a cultural populism that is really compelling to a lot of voters who don't put themselves on an ideological spectrum, who don't crave the kind of right-wing red meat that maybe I crave. And so, yes, I think the PCs are going to win a majority government. You may see some people on specific issue sets who support the New Blue Party because they care about those issues and they don't see the Ford PC speaking on them. But I don't think it speaks to some split on the right, at least not yet.
Martin, I'd like your take on whether or not you agree with Lord Black that because the progressive Conservatives have moved so much into the centre and that the other parties are so far on the left, again, his view, it's vacated the right, and New Blue and, for that matter, Ontario have moved in there.
Well, I think Conrad Black misreads Ontario politics, both with hyperbole, but also hypocrisy. First of all, I'll come to the hypocrisy in a moment. The hyperbole is that, yes, Doug Ford is left there. Doug Ford is definitely non-ideological in a conventional sense, as Ginny might see it. He is a populist, and he's all over the map. Center in some issues, centrist, center right in some issues, repositioning himself, shape-shifting, but also right-wing on other issues. No question. Froze the minimum wage initially. He's tax cutting all the time. He's Mr. Tax Fighter, fee rebater. I see Jenny nodding appreciatively. So on the NDP and the Liberals have not gone to the left. There's a convergence of sorts to the center. The NDP and the Liberals are also tax fighters now. Freezing taxes, Andrea Horwath, $200,000 income. We talked about this last time, Steve. Frozen, no extra tax increases. Stephen Del Duca, cutting taxes on your prepared food. They're all singing from the same songbook in a different way, just different lines. Now, hypocrisy. Conrad Black in that same article talks about his dear friend Caroline Mulroney, and I wonder what Caroline Mulroney and Brian Mulroney think of Conrad Black giving a nod of the hat, a tip of the hat to Jim Karahalios, who has done drive-by Islamophobic smears of Waleed Solomon, a friend of the Mulroneys, works in the same law firm. And so you have to be careful who you play with, because really some of the right-wing stuff, which I know we'll talk about, attracts all kinds of moths.
Jim is not here to defend himself on that, but I would just simply say for the record, he denies what you just said, just for the record. Okay, Sean, your take on the principle we're talking about here.
Well, I think Mr. Black has his causality wrong. I don't think that Doug Ford has pushed the Liberals and New Democrats to the left. I think they've gone willingly. Since about 2014, we've seen a leftward shift of both the provincial Liberals in Ontario and the National Liberal Party. I think there's two reasons for that, Steve. One is ideological. I think the current generation of liberal activists see themselves as progressives and distinguish that from, say, the politics of the Chrétien years, or frankly, even the McGuinty years in some ways. But part of it is tactical. I think there is a view amongst big L liberal strategists that a progressive politics that increasingly marginalizes the New Democrats and the party's value proposition essentially creates a kind of two-party race, and 9 times out of 10, just because of the kind of general ideological underpinnings of Canadian society, a center-left party is going to defeat a center-right party. And so I think we've seen that shift occurring on the left in Canada and in Ontario, and that has been to the benefit of Doug Ford. He's run, as Ginny has said, a pretty moderate government, one at times that has frustrated ideological conservatives like Ginny and me. But it seems to me, from a kind of crass political point of view, the benefits of that approach are self-evident in a world in which the Liberals and New Democrats have, for all intents and purposes, vacated the center of politics on spending, on a kind of hardened form of identity politics. It's certainly to the benefit of Doug Ford, and I think that'll be expressed on election day. Just one final point, Steve, maybe just to drive this point home. The fact that we have 8 unions now endorsing the Progressive Conservative Party.
Private sector unions.
Yes, in this race, I think reflects the fact that the Liberals and New Democrats have kind of lost their way on matters of economic justice, and have been kind of increasingly consumed, as progressives have elsewhere in North America, with a kind of identity politics. And it seems to me one of the outcomes of this race, assuming these polls are correct, is I think it will require progressives to kind of go through a process of introspection. Is identity politics harming the kind of fecundity and resonance of their economic agenda, which polls tell us are actually quite popular?
That's a great question and fodder for a future program. But again, I just want to clarify, the union backing of Premier Ford has really been quite an impressive accomplishment, but they're all private sector unions that whose coffers have been magnificently filled by the capital projects of the current government. There are no public sector unions that are backing the Tories. They're all backing the NDP and a couple of Green candidates. But having said that, Ginny,
to your point, Steve, just really, you're quite right. Also, building trades, right? So construction unions in particular, not just private sector, but specifically the building trade.
Exactly. Yeah. Ginny, I wanted to get your take on. I mean, we've talked a lot about New Blue during the course of the campaign. They've got most of the attention because the Karahalioses, they do tend to attract attention. They're an interesting couple. They had a seat in the last legislature, not elected to it, but Belinda Carr-Halios, when she was kicked out of the PC caucus, joined and created this New Blue Party. But I noticed on television the other day, the Ontario Party of Derek Sloan's they've got commercials out there now. And there's an Ontario First Party and a Libertarian Party that's been around for a while. And, you know, there's still a Trillium Party that's out there, which also is a right-wing party. There are a lot of right-wing alternatives in this province right now. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about what you think is driving the emergence of all of this.
Yes, well, I think those splits are important to note, right, for political outcome purposes. I said at the beginning that I don't think there's going to be much of a political outcome that's relevant, that's driven by the growth of the New Blue. And partially that's because people on the right who want an alternative to the Ford PCs, that effort is kind of split amongst all these different small parties. And they all seem to be sort of single issue or single message parties that, frankly, the other point I'd make is it's really hard to mount a political party and increase your name recognition and get into the media and get it in front of people. New Blue is doing the best job. They have the most candidates nominated. They have a sort of semi-coherent policy platform. The others are sort of vanity projects, I think, for their leaders who are not doing a terribly good job of increasing their name recognition. And so that vote's splitting. But I think part of why they're stuck on one or two issues, particularly COVID, which a lot of people are over now and don't want to think about anymore, is because, yes, I just want to get back to this Ford positioning question. Yes, he's sort of center moderate on economic issues and material issues, where Sean's right, the left really has kind of vacated and moved further to the left and left him that room on the center. But the other piece in terms of these union endorsements and these sort of the kinds of people that are the union members, because I think, by the way, the thing that's driving these union endorsements is their membership, and the leadership's catching up to the membership, not the other way around. The leaders want to be where their members are. And the reason those members are with Ford, for the most part, is because culturally he does have some pretty conservative touch points on crime, building on his brother's legacy of sort of the tax piece and the fees piece that Martin was talking about around stopping the gravy trade, and the Ontario public and the kinds of people who are members of these unions, they want to make sure hospitals are built and highways are built and the province is spending on the things that they want the province to spend on. But they also want a government that's going to be tough on crime. They want a government that's going to, and a leader who kind of speaks to them and uses their language, which Ford is very good on. So it's not as simple as this left-right spectrum. And that's, I think, why you see this fracturing of these parties on the right, because there's no one theme or there's no broad grouping of policies they can seize on that Ford has vacated on the right, because it doesn't really exist.
Let me suggest a theme here. Martin, let me get you to play with this one if you would. Belinda Carr-Halios was kicked out of the PC caucus. She started the New Blue Party. Rick Nichols was kicked out of the PC caucus for refusing to be vaccinated. He's now running for the Ontario Party. Derek Sloan was kicked out of the federal Conservative caucus. He's now the leader of the Ontario Party. How much do you think revenge is behind the creation of all of these new right-wing parties?
Well, connect the dots. It's funny that they didn't form these ideological cause or cri de coeur until they were kicked out and had nowhere else to go, had to leave the sandbox and build one all themselves. So yes, that's the motivation. Revenge or a reprise, let's say. I think you forgot that Randy Hillier, who was flirting with setting up his own party as well, until he got into so much trouble over COVID, anti-vax, convoys, anti-everything, that he kind of fell apart. So absolutely, it is about it's personal, and it is also anti-vax, and in that sense, it is anti-science. They created their own sandboxes, but guess what? Now New Blue can't play well with others. And as often happens in any ideological, even religious atomization, fractures, different denominations. And so if you look at that New Blue's website, you'll see he's attacking the other parties personally. He goes after Randy Hillier for secret conspiracies. He goes after Derek Sloan for secret conspiracies. It's all over the map. They can't play well with others, and it's except with his own wife and the wife with husband.
Well, okay, Sean, I see you smiling, so why don't you just pick up from there?
It's like the Marxist-Leninists fighting with the communists over the over the old communist vote. If I could just make 2 points, Steve, about the conversation so far. I agree with Ginny that in large part because of the weakness of the Liberals and New Democrats in this race, it's unlikely that the rise of these new parties on the right will have a significant impact on the election outcomes. But that was not obvious from the start. You mentioned we've seen some polling that puts the New Blue Party at something like 5 points in this race province-wide. It's worth noting that there are a dozen or so ridings in that the Progressive Conservative Party won in the last election by fewer than 5 points. And so assuming that support leads to some of these other parties, it could put some races in jeopardy. On the other hand, my second point is, in a kind of counterintuitive way, there may be an argument that the proliferation of these parties is good for Doug Ford. One of the challenges that Jason Kenney had in Alberta is a lot of the people that now occupy these different parties in Ontario were part of the Alberta United Conservative Party. And so he had to deal with them in his caucus, within his membership and so on. And, it seems to me some of the very people who now are represented in these different parties in Ontario are the exact people, kind of conceptually, who ultimately sacked Jason Kenney. And so, in a way, while it may pose some local threats for progressive conservatives, I think there's a case that on balance, it probably serves the party well. It enables Doug Ford and the progressive conservatives to position party policies, including on COVID, is kind of moderate and a compromise between demands from the Liberals and the Democrats for more restrictions and demands from these new right-wing parties for fewer restrictions. It seems to me kind of one of the results we might find come Thursday is that the New Blue Party, the Ontario Party, and some of these other parties may ultimately be some of Doug Ford's best friends.
Well, that's the intriguing question. And Ginny, let me pick up on that with you, because if we go back to the last federal election, I think it was, Global News did a survey and they discovered that the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier's party, did so well by stealing votes that the federal Conservative Party otherwise would have had the People's Party not been running, that it cost them 6 seats. Now, in the end, that didn't cost the Conservatives power, but because it wasn't that close an election, in terms of the seat count. But Frank Graves now of ECOS is saying that if New Blue, here's the quote, the New Blue Party could be a critical factor in deciding whether Doug Ford achieves the majority he is seeking. Is it possible, do you think, on Thursday, that New Blue and these other right-wing entrants could take enough votes away from the Progressive Conservative Party, which would otherwise get them, to deny them the seat count they need?
So I think it's highly unlikely that Ford will not win a majority on Thursday. I think the polling shows us that he is winning so many votes in the center and on the center right that he will form probably a large majority. That's what it's looking like. So it's not a short-term political challenge for him, but I do think it's a long-term political consideration for him. And where I might differ with Sean a little bit is, I think it was a legitimate challenge for Aaron O'Toole that he let what is a huge coalition of right-of-center voters in Canada kind of split. Right, he sent a lot of voters to the PPC because he was so fixated on moderating himself for votes in the center that ultimately he didn't win enough of to balance out what he lost on the right. You saw something similar in intra-party dynamics for Jason Kenney and the UCP in Alberta. And that is a risk for any right-of-center leader who's trying to hold together a broad coalition in basically any province in Canada, maybe with the exception of the Atlantic provinces. If Ford wins a majority government, that helps. It gives him a lot of breathing room, but he's going to have to face at some point a policy convention with his party members who will feel a bit more open, I think, to challenging him if they feel like they don't get what they need from him. And he doesn't have a set of policies and priorities, some of which appeal to those voters on the right. I'll bring up, for instance, education policy. I think partly driven by COVID, people in Ontario have been very, very frustrated by education policy, and conservatives haven't had a lot to say about it. The left does, and we know what their view is, but there are all sorts of innovative, interesting, right of center takes on bringing marketplace economics to education in a way that drives better quality outcomes for students. And you don't hear a peep about that from the Ontario PCs. In those big areas of concern, if conservatives just keep vacating those policy areas, eventually voters will start to look for an alternative. So that's something I think they have to be aware of, and I think they will be. And they'll with a majority government, hopefully they'll have the room to explore some of those policy areas, and hopefully people like Sean will drive some of that policy thinking. And I think that's also why you see at the federal level in the conservative leadership race, you see candidates really trying to bring back together that broad coalition.
Martin, you and I are old enough to. Yeah, sorry, you wanted to pick
go
up
ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Okay,
I was going to jump in if I could. Just sorry, we're talking over each other a little bit because of the lags in technology. But just to pick up on your question about, I was surprised when I read that comment from Frank, because not just because it does seem as if the ceiling will almost guarantee, or certainly likely be, a conservative majority, but this was a consideration many months ago when the thought, the expectation was that the right-wing parties wouldn't actually win a single seat, but that they could deprive the Tories of a couple of close ridings, narrow margins of victory the last time, oddly enough, even in Toronto. So, for example, King of Surma in Etobicoke might have been in some peril. I think a lot of pollsters, the consensus is that not only will the right not win a single seat, but they won't deprive the Tories of a single seat. That doesn't mean it couldn't have happened, and it couldn't have been a close call if there had been other breaks. So that's one thought. Just to Jenny's point, though, I also think while Aaron O'Toole had his hands full dealing with these kinds of splinterings and pushback, Ontario is not Canada, so that the analogies can't be drawn too closely. But there's another important point. Ontario, the most powerful conservative leader in Canada for many years, has not been Jason Kenney or Aaron O'Toole or Andrew Scheer. It won't be Pierre Poilievre. It's Doug Ford, because he has power in Canada's second biggest government. And with power comes the ability to discipline, to expel, to demand compliance, because not just because you're scaring people, but because these backbenchers don't want to lose their perch in caucus, their salary supplements as PAs or deputy speakers and so on. So I think that's part of it. And just one final quick thing to Jenny about education. Actually, the Conservatives flirted with some reforms. They tried to impose mandatory online learning, and there was a lot of pushback to that. Other parties have experimented with educational reform. The Green Party, another outlying party, not out there, but outlying in terms of being at about 5% support. They were talking for years about removing the separate school system, religious funding for Catholic schools. They don't talk about that anymore. So there is some convergence on education because it's not selling right now.
That's still technically part of their platform. I did confirm that earlier in this campaign, for the Green Party, that is, putting the school system under unified governance. But they're not campaigning on it because they say the school system's been through enough and they don't want to put it through any more hecticness. I'm sure that's not a word, but it's the first thing that came to mind. No, listen, Sean, I want to try this one more time with you, because I think this is a real thing, only because we've seen it before. And I'm old enough to remember back in 1990, there was a party called the Family Coalition Party, and there was another Northern Ontario grievance party called the Confederation of Regions Party, both of whom combined to earn 200,000 votes and those votes came from both Liberal and Conservative candidates and helped create the perfect storm of odd vote splits that allowed the NDP to win a majority government in that election. Now, it hasn't happened again since, but again, when you see all of the attention that these new right-wing parties are getting, I think it's a reasonable question to ask, could that phenomenon happen again on Thursday? What do you think?
I think the short answer on Thursday is no, but I take the broader point, Steve. You gave a historical analogy. Let me give you one. We're speaking today on almost the 26th anniversary of the Winds of Change conference in Calgary that was hosted by David Frum and others to try to start the process of uniting the right at the federal level. We know the consequences of this kind of fragmentation in conservative politics. We lived with it for the better part of 15 or 20 years at the national level. So I think it does represent a real risk. I think the question before conservative leaders in Ontario and nationally is how they can incorporate some of these voices and ideas that are represented in the New Blue Party and the Ontario Party and others, without alienating or turning off swing voters across the country that are ultimately crucial for Conservatives to win national and provincial elections. Ginny, as you mentioned, is involved in Pierre Poilievre's leadership race. Mr. Poilievre clearly has a kind of vision and strategy to bring some of the voters that were lost in the 2021 federal election back into the Conservative fold. And the question for him between now and should he become leader is he able to do that? Is he able to kind of walk the line of advancing ideas and messages that appeal to those voters without turning off other voters? And as we've been talking today, Doug Ford, for a host of, I think, contingent and particularistic reasons here in the province of Ontario, has had an easier path to walk than a series of Conservative leaders have nationally. So I guess that's a long way of saying, Steve, even though I think what you're hearing from us is that this probably won't be a major issue this week, it is most definitely an issue that has dogged Conservatives in the past and will continue to dog them in the future. And the kind of politics around the pandemic has only made that job more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ginny, that prompts a sort of, fancy pants view from 30,000 feet kind of question that I want to ask you right now, which is really what it means to be a Conservative in Ontario at this moment in our history. I mean, this progressive Conservative Ontario government has done some very unconservative things. If you compare it, for example, to the last Conservative government of Mike Harris. This is a premier who's done press conferences with union leaders. This is a leader who's done a lot of pro-labor policy. He's raised the minimum wage. This is a leader that's done a bunch of things that I think a lot of Conservatives are shaking their heads at. So what does it mean to be a Conservative right now in Ontario?
Well, Steve, the world's also changed, right? And when you talk about that labor policy, the life of a worker and the job that they're in today is nothing like the life of a worker under the Mike Harris government. And so, kudos to Minister Monty McNaughton, the Minister of Labor, and the Premier for trying to lead on those issues. Conservatives so often get our lunch eaten on innovative policies that address the problems of today for people. And the Premier and Monty McNaughton have not let that happen. They've led on that, and actually Sean sat on a panel, I think, at the minister's request to advise them on some of those innovative policies. So that's great. And don't forget on economics, there's no question that this is a big spending government. And right now, I don't think there's a lot of appetite to cut back on that. But Martin, I'll bring it up again on fees and taxes. The issue that everyone's fixated on right now when it comes to the economy is not, there are lots of jobs. It's not growth. It's affordability. People can barely get gas in their tanks. And, if you want to talk about affordability, Ford was mocked for running against the carbon tax, but I think in large part he won because of his position on the carbon tax. And he's totally kneecapped the ability of the NDP or the Liberal leadership to talk about the price of gas, because everyone knows that they wanted to increase it by design. That was the design of the carbon tax, was to increase the price of gas. And now when people can't afford it, that's the last thing they want to hear. And that sounds pretty conservative to me. For the PCs to be able to run on that record, that's pretty powerful.
Well, okay, but on the other hand, Martin, we see so many different incarnations of what it means to be a Conservative Party these days that I wonder whether or not the days of sort of everybody reasonably happily coexisting under one big blue tent are over. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think, remember, Randy Hillier was kind of welcomed into the Progressive Conservative Party by none other than John Tory when he was leader of the Ontario PCs. The idea of the big blue tent brought Randy Hillier within until he became bring your enemies close within. But at a certain point, it became too much to handle. And Randy Hillier, too, was expelled from the Progressive Conservative Party and just went to a different place. And so Jason Kenney tried that. Of course, he had a different imperative. It wasn't just pulling in the Ontario landowners, which is Randy Hillier's old home. It was trying to block out the NDP by uniting two parties. So bringing in the tent and trying to bring them all within is a seductive strategy or tactic. But it can blow up, and that's what happened. That's what Doug Ford did. He said, you know what, this isn't working. This is actually fragmenting, and I'm losing discipline. A lesson that Jason Kenney learned at the cost of his leadership too late. because he didn't crack down, and perhaps he couldn't. I mean, they're different parties, different provinces, different personalities. I mean, Jenny talking about the unions. Part of it also is that Doug Ford can cast himself as the everyman and break down or surmount some of these ideological barriers. And also, Doug Ford stopped beating up the unions, by which I mean he stopped calling these elected labor leaders union bosses and spitting out the word. And Monty McNaughton stopped spitting out the word too. They reformed. They now hold joint photo ops with them. So part of it is just playing nice, and that gets you far in politics.
Sean, in our last minute here, maybe I can get you to weigh in on, some of these parties come and go. Others, like the Greens, are still around 35 years later and are finally electing MPPs now. Of all of the new right-wing entrants on the Ontario political scene, who's here for good, do you think?
It's a great question, Steve. I think the outstanding question, not just for these new right-wing parties in Ontario, but even the People's Party of Canada, is whether this is merely a pandemic-induced political development or if it has longer legs. You mentioned that the People's Party did something like 5% nationally in the last election. That jumped from about 1% when Maxime Bernier tried to run against immigration. It was when he found the political magic of anti-pandemic restrictions that his numbers went up. So I guess that's a long way of saying, Steve, unless some of these Ontario parties can find a successor issue to pandemic restrictions, my gut is that long-term those voters will ultimately come home. And I think the same probably will apply nationally, especially if Pierre Poilievre's elected, because he talks to some of these voters in a kind of form of muscle memory, whereas some of the other leadership candidates may have a harder time bringing some of those voters home because it's less of a kind of intramural conversation. So I guess that's a long way of saying I don't see these parties being with us for good.
Normally, I thank the guests from left to right on this program, but for this one, it feels appropriate to do it from right to left. So let me thank Sean Speer, who's in New York, Jenny Roth in Toronto, Martin Redcon in Midtown. Thanks for being on the agenda tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, May 31st, 2022. Tomorrow, on the eve of the election, we'll speak to some veterans of past campaigns to find out what was this election really about anyway. Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.